Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Addis Dialogue with the program. I'm Shifaraulakawa, and my guest today is Alastair Thompson, who has come all the way from New Zealand to Ethiopia, and he's paid a visit to different parts of Ethiopia, and I'm going to spend some time with him talking about what he observed. Do stay with us. Alastair, thank you so much for joining me.
It's nice to be here.
I want to jump right into it and ask you this question. You are a reporter, editor, and also publisher of New Zealand's politics and international relations publication, scoop.co.nz, right?
Yes.
And you've come all the way from New Zealand to Ethiopia and have paid a visit to different parts of Ethiopia. And I'm curious here, why? What are some of the reasons that you came here?
Well, I came for the rain and stayed for the coffee. I was originally going to be here for 3 weeks, but I've extended the trip to about 7 weeks in the end.
Okay.
But I've been following the Ethiopian story very closely since around March 2021, and at that point, we just come out of the American elections, and this war basically began on the day of the American election, and I hadn't really paid enough attention to it. I mean, I was aware that there was a war and didn't really know anything about Ethiopia, didn't really know anything about much at all, but I was initially interested in the Gerd Dam because of climate issues, which I'm very interested in, and then basically became very interested in the political situation, the dynamics between Egypt, the filling of the dam, and the election, which was coming up in June, and I mean, after that, it became too interesting to move away from, I think, for me anyway.
Okay. Yeah. As I see in my intro, you paid a visit to different parts of Ethiopia during your stay here in this East African nation, and I presume that your visits have revealed some of the horrible things, unfortunately, while you stayed in different parts of Ethiopia or in different states of Ethiopia. So I really want to ask you this question. What are some of the immense, infrastructural damage and also immeasurable human sufferings that you had to see, if any, of course? So,
I mean, that was a key part of my reason to come. So the timing of my trip was related particularly to the Gondar University study report, which was announced in a press conference, I think, in early April.
Yeah.
And I arrived on the 21st. And I see that study and that piece of work that they're doing as being particularly important. There's a wonderful documentary called Tears of Welkite that they've made about the story of 30 years of occupation of the area which the TPLF call Western Tigray, but which is a series of parts of Gondar in Amhara region.
Yeah.
And so that was the first place I went, and I went to flew into Gondar and then drove up to Addis, which is a sort of like a militarized area, sort of that area around the Tekeze river border with Tigray is now heavily militarized, and I went there to visit Addis, which is a village in which they found a mass grave very close to the village, and excavated it partially, and they found 12 bodies there buried on top of each other. I mean, they're not in a cemetery, but they stopped excavating after getting to 12 skulls, essentially. One of the skulls shows clear evidence of being killed by gunshot, but I mean, the rest of there's a lot of work to be done, basically, on the forensic sort of mass graves, and that's just one of large numbers of potential mass grave sites identified in that particular area, which is a remote mountain valley, and there was a camp there which was called Gehenib, which was a base of the TPLF towards the end of the Derg War. And while I was there, I interviewed Kafang fighters who were part of the original resistance when the TPLF first arrived over the Tikezi River, from sort of, I don't know, the late 70s, early 80s, through to 1991 when the war ended with the Derg. And one of those people was the person who actually found these mass graves. He actually left and went to Sudan, and then had done a lot of detective work trying to figure out what had happened at this place.
Yeah.
And he identified the spot of this mass graves. And then there was another chap who was a Derg soldier who was held prisoner in this prison for 3 years. And he survived because he was an artillery expert and a mapping expert, and one of the leaders of the TPLF wanted to keep him alive because they thought that he would be useful for them militarily. And eventually they set him free, and he went to Tigray, but then ran away. And I mean, he burst into. I mean, he was very emotional in the interview, remembering. And I mean, I felt like I had to get him to recount his experiences. He was talking in Amharic, and I was getting a partial translation in English. But
okay.
I mean, it was terribly sad.
Yeah.
There's also Weldabar. I've interviewed the monks from there who were invaded 9 months ago, across the Tikezi River. They tried to install their own monks in the monastery. The monks said no, and then they started torturing and killing monks. All the monks, well, 75% of the monks have now left. Mm-hmm. Many of them have been killed. A lot of them been tortured. And now they've built a military camp in this ancient monastery, which is 1,600 years old. In Abala, I went to the hospital, which had been destroyed by the TPLF in early January,
yeah.
When they invaded Zone 2, in a much larger invasion than I think was reported, and they displaced several 100,000 people. Some went north and hid in the sort of pastoral areas, and some went south, and large numbers of women. I interviewed in FR. I mean, I think I interviewed about six different women who had fled, and they had walked for. I mean, their husbands and some of their older sons had stayed to fight the TPLF, and they eventually succeeded in pushing the TPLF back. But many of them left with nothing, and taking many children and walking for miles through essentially sort of fairly barren land.
Yeah.
In summary, I wanted to see the real evidence of what has happened here, because
yeah.
there's so many disputes and lies about what has happened here in the media.
Yeah.
And the stories I found here were different than the ones that I had heard in the media, and they clearly show the level of horrific activities which the TPLF has undertaken in the course of this war quite recently.
While you were traveling to the different parts of Ethiopia and visiting the different parts of this East African nation, it seems that you also had to hear about, human rights violations. So I really want to ask you this question. Were you perhaps shocked by the similar patterns of violations and destruction wherever you went?
Very, very much so. So I mean, one of the big themes which seems to come from the early Welkite experience is this experience of people being thrown off cliffs to their death.
So horrible.
Well, yeah, appalling. But there's there was when we went to the top of a mountain, which is sort of north of Gondar, and across the border in Welkite from Karaka, which was the site of a big battle at the beginning of the war.
Yeah.
And in this town, there was a well-known businessman who had continued to maintain his Amhara identity. And a lot of the people that were killed in Welkite were killed because they insisted on remaining Amhara and saying that they were Amhara, even though they were living in the Welkite region. Now, this is right at the very, very edge of the boundary between Gondar and what the TPLF call Western Tigray.
Yeah.
And this man was kidnapped and thrown off a cliff. And he was an elder in the community, a popular person. And this happened, I think, 2019, maybe 2020. I'm not sure. It was very recent.
Yeah.
So that, I mean, they're still doing it. I mean, anyone that knows Ethiopia realizes that there are cliffs everywhere.
Of course.
And especially in Welkite. This is a very wild country. And, I mean, yeah, who knows what's happened? And, I mean, what a terrible way to kill people.
It's inhuman.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yes. Of course, you told me that you interviewed some people while you stayed there. What other horrible ordeals did they tell you? What did you find out?
So, I mean, in Afar, I was particularly appalled at the conditions in the IDP refugee camps, and the contrast between the conditions in some of those refugee camps and the massive amounts of aid which are pouring into Tigray. Up the road, past the people that are living there. I mean, there's complex interaction between the government and the UN agencies that provide aid, and there are concerns about the quantity of aid that the UN has. But the UN appears to be only concerned about the people in Tigray. It seems, I mean, nearly everything. The only IDPs they do mention Amhara and Afar now, but I mean, for a long time they didn't, and the war moved into Amhara and Afar, and Amhara and Afar have been the main victims of this war since July 2021. No one has invaded Tigray in that period of time, and I mean the narrative which is told in the West is that there is a siege and that the government of Ethiopia is blocking the access to aid, when in actual fact TPLF continues to attack the roads which are needed for aid to get to them.
Yeah.
And I mean, this is particularly the case in Afar, and we can talk about that later. But the conditions in the IDP camps were just dreadful. I mean, they had a hospital clinic. There's 40,000 people in this camp, 8,000 families, mostly children. I mean, I think probably 50–60% children, and old people and women, and it's surrounded by little canals which are full of dirty, very dirty water, and they don't have enough water, and they don't have enough food.
Yeah.
They have to buy the food in the nearby town because they're not officially recognised as IDPs. And I couldn't get to the bottom of the story of, well, why isn't this camp designated as a IDP camp? And the UN claims, well, this is a matter for the government to determine. But I do wonder whether the UN itself has some influence over this. I mean, they wanted all of these refugees officially to be placed in a camp which is in an area which is inappropriate. It's too hot, and there's no cover, and so forth. And I mean, it's not. I mean, I don't want to attribute blame anywhere, but the victims of the invasion here, thousands of them, and there was at that stage there was a risk of a measles epidemic, but it sounds as though the tests came back negative. Measles is not there, thank God, and there was in fact a vaccination effort that took place. But yeah, I mean, the children. I saw this little girl who had just gone to the water, gone to one of these places and gathered some water, because you can't. I mean, they get 5 litres a day. That's all the water that they were being provided per person. And she went to one of these little streams, and she'd come back with 2 little bottles of water, little small jerry cans, and she was going to wash her dress, which was very dirty.
Yeah.
And then she sort of walked away after I sort of took photographs of her, and I feel like I might have frightened her a little bit. And then I saw her drinking this water, which part of the reason I was there was because Malika from the Afar Pastoral Development Association wanted to deliver them soap and wanted to provide education to try and keep the children away from this water, because it's giving them skin conditions and so forth. And then this little girl drinks the water, and she was emaciated, and it's terrible. And the Afar acute malnutrition rates, even according to the UN, are twice those of Tigray. And Amhara is higher than the malnutrition in Tigray, but most of the effort seems to be being directed at addressing the need in Tigray.
Yeah, okay. You know what? previously I have tried to interview foreign journalists like you that came to Ethiopia and personally witnessed what is going on here in that country, and surprisingly they all told me similar stories and similar patterns of horrific incidents. But the problem is not many foreign journalists have seen Ethiopia just like you guys are doing. So what is your message to foreign journalists covering Ethiopian stories?
They need to understand that this is a war of lies. Probably more importantly than being an actual war, this is a war of lies. It started as a war of lies.
Okay.
And the war of lies has been won by the TPLF. They have an extraordinary array of weapons that they are utilising in the information war. Lobbyists, journalists who are either co-opted or convinced that there are fixed narratives that they have to tell. I mean, they exploit the weaknesses of the media, the fact that the media often only come to a place for sort of 4 or 5 days and they need to know exactly what the story is that they're going to tell before they leave.
Okay.
I mean, Nima El-Bagir is sort of the worst example of this. And I mean, her most recent sort of like expedition to Ethiopia sort of became unstuck because one of the TPLF leaders there's video leaked of his conversation behind something or other. Yeah. Former ambassador of the TPLF, and he was meeting with all these American and European ambassadors, and he said that he expected that there was going to be some more bodies coming down the Tekezi River, which would have been the third time that Nima El-Bagir had attempted to try and tell this story. Mm-hmm. And I think CNN dropped it, but and she now seems to have been sidelined. She's been given some new titles, fancy title, Chief Investigative Reporter or something, but she doesn't seem to be producing any work. I mean, I think the international media need to start again with an open mind, and they need to go back to the beginning of this war and begin with what happened on November the 3rd and the 4th, and look at what happened before November the 3rd and the 4th. Yeah. Senator Chris Coons signed on to a letter which was published by the Von Batten Montague, the lobbyist who has been one of the constant presences in this war for the TPLF, on the 31st of October, before the election, before the war had even started. And at that stage, he appeared to be representing Oromo interests. Mm-hmm. And people need to understand that TPLF is not just TPLF. It represents various other organisations. It uses front groups. It uses money to manipulate people. It has massive, sophisticated ways of manipulating public opinion. It's an astonishingly, difficult foe for the Ethiopian government. And I mean, journalists really just need to not to stick to this tried and true thinking that everything that is published by the New York Times, everything that's published by the Washington Post and the Telegraph is true. I mean, the Telegraph has published complete rubbish by Lucy Casa. The BBC recently published one of the most appalling editorial judgments I've ever seen is the publication of that Lucy Casa piece, where she alleges that the Gondar researchers themselves were involved in the destruction of evidence. Yeah. I mean, this is some kind of sort of fever dream of the chief propaganda. Just get at you. It's a problem. Yeah. Big problem.
Okay. Talking about the TPLF, we're also hearing that the TPLF is gonna wage yet another round of war against the government, and we're also learning that it is deploying the youngsters in the state of Tigray to join the army. Do you have any information in this regard, maybe from your personal observations?
So there's two sets of information which establish this. Well, there's three. They did it before. They've done it consistently throughout the war.
Yeah.
Thousands of Tigrayan youth have died on the front lines. There's a photographer based here in Addis called Abel, who was embedded with the ENDF on the front line from September through to December. He showed me the pictures of the dead child soldiers, I'm sure he has a lot more.
Okay.
And I've seen pictures from other sources as well of the dead child soldiers. And they're just in one of these pictures there was a whole lot of young women, all dead and piled up. So this has happened before. Secondly, I mean, human waves, it also happened in the 1998 war with Eritrea. I don't know if it was child soldiers exactly, but certainly human waves were used to clear minefields. The TPLF have a history of complete disregard to their own soldiers, and they've been killing their children in horrendous numbers. Now, beyond that, we have Anne Fitzgerald. Professor Anne Fitzgerald did a recent study where she interviewed 162 Tigray people, a combination of prisoners of war and people who'd fled across the border in the Waghimra sort of zone, and mostly to Sokoto, and who are now based in a camp. And she did focus group interviews with them, and I mean, they all told the same story. And they told the story that there was forced conscription, and that if you wanted to receive humanitarian aid for your family to eat, then you needed to give up a child. And we're talking the older children here. We're talking about the children who ordinarily would be able to help the parents with looking after the younger children in these families. And then on top of that, we also have video, which the TPLF is now denying is real. But it's plain to see that we have the head of the political division of one of the Central Committee members basically saying that everybody has to provide a fighter, every family has to provide a fighter, and threatening the Tigrayans if they don't do so. So, I mean, how much evidence does there need to be?
Yeah, absolutely. In this connection also, Alastair, we are hearing all the reports that the TPLF is putting the parents, mothers and fathers into jail simply because they are refusing to let their children join its army against the federal government. Do you have any information in this regard?
Well, that's another thing which came out of Anne Fitzgerald's paper.
Okay.
And I mean, I think we should. Yeah, I mean, the paper has become a focal point for TPLF disinformation, and attacks on Professor Anne Fitzgerald and her work are enormous. I mean, they're very, very strong, very well organised, and continuing now months later. And I think they realise just how important her findings in that paper were. And I mean, she has been researching the war, wars and conflict and military issues in this country for more than 20 years, and she knows the TPLF intimately through working with them. I mean, I think she may have even trained some of them at some times in some aspects of their work. So, I mean, she's the most credible and strong voice in this war of lies that Ethiopia has. And I mean, I would, I mean, I have no reason to disbelieve her finding.
The government is accusing the TPLF of clearly refusing or lending deaf ear to the various peace initiative efforts that it has been taking, and also the indefinite humanitarian truce, to facilitate for the much needed aid to the state of Tigray, and also other peace initiatives, as you know. So I want to ask you this question: why is the TPLF seemingly not satisfied with that, in your view?
Because they don't need to be satisfied with it, because the international community doesn't seem to care about those humanitarian ceasefire efforts either. Everybody seems to be in agreement that when Tigray was occupied after the initial defeat of the TPLF in the first half of 2021, that there was plenty of aid was delivered. After, on the 28th of June, the first unilateral humanitarian ceasefire was declared, and the TPLF immediately responded by saying it was a sick joke, and the international community then applauded, and numerous news reports claimed that the TPLF had some great victory over some sort of, I don't know, terrible enemy that was portrayed as being a terrible enemy by the Human Rights Watch and Amnesty in reports which basically were founded on bogus evidence. There is a university in Holland called Ghent University, which has been the primary source of mapping what they say are the conflict incidents and various other activities that have taken place inside Tigray up till that point, up till that sort of June point. But this university is staffed by people who are extremely partisanly associated with TPLF. I mean, it's the geography department of Ghent University. Jan Nyssen, its head, and several of its staff are clearly TPLF associates. And the European Union and the United Nations and the United States relies on its data. I mean, these are part of the issues in relation to the humanitarian issue. I mean, why? Because they don't need to concede. They don't need to stop the war because nobody's even asked them to. I can't recall. I mean, there are statements that are made where both sides are called to come to an agreement.
Right.
But there is one party to this conflict that has resolutely refused to come to any agreement. They called the first humanitarian ceasefire a sick joke. The second one in December, after they withdrew, they actually attacked Afar before they even announced the withdrawal. And the international community just ignored the fact that they had taken the road, which was where the aid route was supposed to come through, invaded the area, displaced thousands of people in Afar, and I mean, they are acting with impunity because they are not being held to account by the international organizations who claim that is their role and their moral authority. And this is the reason.
Yeah. Okay. Also, the international community is not well informed about Ethiopia. In fact, it is being fed by misinformation and disinformation by some Western media outlets. So the realities on the ground and what they are being fed is totally far-fetched, as many said. So from your personal visit to Ethiopia, what is the discrepancy like, between what is being propagated and what is actually on the ground here in Ethiopia?
Well, it's immense. I mean, the difference between. I mean, I recently had a discussion with an ambassador. I won't say which nation, but he was trying to tell me he'd been here for 3 months, and he was trying to tell me that well, it's a complicated situation. There's two sides to this story. We don't really know what's going on. This is not true. We know exactly what's going on. The Tigray has not had anybody invade it since June the 28th. The TPLF have attacked Afara and Amhara on multiple occasions over that period of time. They've marched on Addis Ababa. And I don't know of any occasion where there has been a concerted call for the TPLF to cease their war. And as long as the international community continues to enable the TPLF through active statements and through silence, silence is just as powerful. If the TPLF have managed to create this sort of indestructible narrative around Tigray genocide, when in fact there's a lot of evidence that they have themselves committed genocidal-like activities in Welkite, killing large numbers of people, cultural genocide, making people speak different languages, desecrating cultural sites, stealing religious artifacts, all of that stuff. There is a lot of solid evidence of that, and that's why the Gondar study is so important.
Yeah.
But the international community, for whatever reason, it's very hard to understand. Is it because of inertia? Is it because they can't change their minds? Because it would be too embarrassing for them to admit that they have made an absolutely terrible mistake? I'm not sure what it is, but this is the reason that the TPLF continue. This war would finish if the United States in particular, withdrew their support.
Okay, okay. Talking about the media, since you are visiting Ethiopia for some time now, I'm sure that you have made some observations of Ethiopian media outlets. Where are Ethiopian media outlets on the scale of properly refuting the media narrations, propaganda, whatever, in your rating?
Well, I think it's a tale of two stories. There's two different positions. So I've had interesting interactions with Ethiopian News Agency and with several other sort of mainstream, if you like, reporters. And I think they're doing the best job that they can do. But unfortunately, I don't think local media is really resourced enough to conduct the sort of reporting which is needed in the field.
Okay.
There is also problems in terms of the government not providing as much information as would be hopefully provided, so that they would have solid information to disseminate.
Mm-hmm.
But I think they're doing a good job, and I think there's very solid editorial values within the traditional mainstream media, so the television stations, the press agencies, and the newspapers. I mean, the newspapers are well written. I mean, I'm talking about the English ones, but
of course,
I expect that the Amharic ones are as well.
Okay.
On the other hand, there's social media, and social media has become the playground of the TPLF. It's where they launched the war. They launched the Tigray genocide hashtag on the day of the war, which is kind of crazy. Like, how could the genocide have happened and be possible if they've only just started the war?
Yeah.
And I mean, there's studies about that. Rand Corporation did a study which looks into it in some detail. YouTube is also problematic because it feeds off of Twitter. So there's a lot of and rumour, and again, the government providing more factual information and responding in a more timely manner to controversies and to false information, which is disseminated in Facebook and Twitter in particular, would be, I think, enormously helpful from a media perspective.
Okay.
And then there's the silence as well, and I think silence is a big problem, and it's a big problem on both the international side and on the
Ethiopian side.
On the Ethiopian side. I mean, there are so many stories that are just not told at all. I mean, there needs to be more reporters out in the field. There needs to be more reporters that are doing learning the art of conflict reporting. I mean, they will then be able to serve extremely well in other parts of Africa and other conflicts.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. Let's also talk about the sanctions, threats of sanctions that Ethiopia is facing as we speak. As you know, Ethiopia is being challenged by some sanctions and threats of sanctions, especially by the United States of America, including the HR 6600 S3199. So I want to ask you this question as well. In your view, why are they resorting to, threatening Ethiopia with sanctions? What have you made out of this?
Okay, so these bills were introduced in November 2021.
Yeah.
At a time when the TPLF had just about attacked Addis, had come very close to, and CNN had very shrilly reported that Addis was about to fall.
Right.
And I mean, that was never really on the cards. I think maybe CNN had been misled by the State Department into thinking that this was about to happen. The State Department was demanding that everybody leave. And shortly after that, we saw this bill introduced by Senator Menendez, the Democratic Party chair of the Foreign Relations Senate Committee, S3199, and also a companion bill, I think maybe a little bit later in the House. And these bills are, they essentially, it's almost like Ethiopia would be placed in shackles. It would, the US government would have a whole lot of sort of deadlines that it had to respond to, reporting to Congress about various matters, and Ethiopian politics would be politicized inside the House of Congress in a very sort of bureaucratic way, as if Ethiopia was on detention and time out and had to be managed in how it was going to control its country. But the thing is, this happened during the time that the TPLF attacked, and then were pushed back. And it was after they were pushed back that they suddenly introduced these bills. I don't think there's any other way of interpreting the introduction of the bills at that time as an act of hostility against Ethiopia by the United States, and particularly by the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
This is not, I mean, there may be bipartisan support for some of these measures, but they were introduced by senior ranking members and supported by senior ranking members of the Democratic Party.
Yeah, yeah, okay. Beautifully put, Alastair. Let's also talk about internal issues of Ethiopia, and I'm sure that you've heard about Ethiopia's national dialogue. Well, let's also talk about that. You know, as you know, Ethiopia is set to hold its all-inclusive national dialogue soon. The major objective of the national dialogue is, you know, to resolve political differences through civil deliberations and dialogue. So as someone who is closely following new developments in Ethiopia, what have you made out of the moves, and what are some of your suggestions?
So being here has helped me understand how difficult the national dialogue is going to be.
Okay.
It's helped me to understand the nature of ethnic federalism and how that has divided the nation, and how there is these sort of layers of ethnic conflict. I mean, there are structural layers of conflict, which I think a lot of them are actually organised by malign actors, but there are also fault lines. There are real fault lines between peoples. There's fear, and there's animosity, and there's real death. I mean, there's very real death of Amhara in Welaga and Benishangul Gumuz in particular, but that's not the only. Those aren't the only places where there is conflict. And ethnic federalism was designed to achieve that. I mean, the TPLF are a small party. They in a small part of Ethiopia. There's only 6 million of them, and they're trying to govern a nation with 115 million people. And this was part of their design. It's always been part of their strategy. People have to declare which ethnicity they are. Yeah. Which is crazy. Like every time I meet someone, they've got an Amhara mother, or Amhara father, Hara grandparents. I mean, yeah. Everybody is mixed, just as people in Europe are mixed.
Yeah, it's everywhere.
The whole idea of the notion of sort of some degree of ethnic difference is foolish. But the Constitution pits the various different regions against each other, and it's inherently unstable. It's also much easier to form an ethnic political party than it is any other kind of political party. And the other easy party to form is a regional political party. Yeah. So in other places you have parties which represent communities of interest, like rich people, poor people. I mean, those sorts of differentiations, workers and bosses, which is a more traditional way of sort of, I don't know, socialism, social democracy, neoliberalism.
Yeah.
Then it's an ideological battle. But so that's the problem which has to be bridged. Now, I attended a political science conference in Bahir Dar, which was addressing this precise issue, and there was a professor from Canada called Gaddafi who has been doing some work here with the Ministry of Peace, and his presentation particularly resonated with me because he said this is all about psychology ultimately, and and it needs to be addressed at that level. It needs to be addressed at the level of people's feelings. And because if you attempt to try to address it in terms of negotiations about regional autonomy and all those sorts of things, you'll just end up you won't end up with consensus. Now, I asked him whether or not faith was also a potentially very important part of this, because faith, from what I've seen here, faith is the thing that holds this country together. It's the glue it's the foundation of the society and its strength. I mean, things are actually pretty well organised here.
Yeah.
People are very well behaved. You don't feel unsafe in the streets. People are extremely polite. There's not a lot of, in spite of all this ethnic federalism worries, there isn't a lot of conflict amongst the ordinary people of Ethiopia. Or even, I don't know, animosity necessarily. There might be sort of, I don't know, grizzlings and grumblings and stuff.
Yeah.
And there's a sharing of faith. There is a I don't know 1600-year history of religious tolerance of Muslims and Christians and interfaith marriage, and inter-ethnic marriage. And I think that's where, I mean, the national dialogue. It's time to take 3 years. I think that's probably about right. I think it's really important that the government and all the parts of the government show commitment to it, because I think there's a lot of the public are concerned that the government is essentially just EPRDF and new clothes, and that the interests of the members of the government will not coincide with a new constitution, which is pretty much what, I don't know, all of the people that I've spoken to seem to think is necessary. So, I mean, it's going to be a difficult path, but it's the right path to take. And I mean, at the end of it, a referendum is probably the best way to decide whether or not Ethiopia changes itself and removes this imposition of this foolish way of governing itself.
And the constitutionality as well.
Yeah.
Okay. One of the people whose name is, mentioned in connection with the TPLF is Dr. Tedros Adhanom. So let's also talk about the re-election of Dr. Tedros Adhanom as the chief of the World Health Organization. As you know, the West used to accuse him of various issues previously, especially in connection with the coronavirus. But all of a sudden, we're seeing this change of stance, and now he's re-elected. What have you made out of all these? What are some of your observations?
I think the UN institutions are completely unfit for purpose. They were designed after the Second World War, and they came into being in the period following the Second World War. And the re-election of Dr. Tedros, against the wishes of its own country, who made a complaint about him, and who sought to have there to be some kind of the government wanted there to be an inquiry into his failure to basically uphold the principles of the UN in terms of their impartiality.
Yeah.
Dr. Tedros has used his platform hundreds, if not thousands of times, and not just his platform, whose official platform, especially in the last 3 months. In the last 3 months, he has used the COVID conferences, press conferences, to issue statements about Tigray's plight, which has nothing to do with COVID. And he made these statements, and he's been doing all this stuff at a time when he must have known, as all senior UN officials must have known, that the reason that there was no aid getting into Tigray on the aid route was because TPLF was occupying the road, and they were fighting a war on it. Now, the UN sort of hides behind these. I've said this before in this interview, but I mean, it hides behind the idea that it's being impartial to protect the TPLF, and at the same time, Dr. Tedros uses the megaphone diplomacy and the influence of various other. I mean, due to his seniority, the ability to silence other voices who might have I don't know, disagreed with him within the UN administration, to attack Ethiopia. I mean, silence is enough. In the face of lies, sort of like an overwhelming blanket of lies, the silence of the UN on the real issues that are taking place here is enough.
Yeah.
I mean, the WFP lost more than 1,000 trucks in the First War. And I mean, I'm not convinced that we have transparency now about what's happening on the Afar route. I mean, it's now opened up, but yeah, it's not. Yeah, it's a mess.
A mess indeed. Finally, I really want you to comment on Russo-Ukrainian war and its impacts, not only on Ethiopia, but also on Africa, including the way that some Western media outlets are covering the issues in, the war between Russia and Ukraine, and creating a link between Africa and how patronizing and sometimes racist they are. Have you made some observations in this regard?
Well, I mean, the Ukraine, yeah, I mean, it's obvious that they even say it, like, it's not that these people are like us. Yeah. These are Europeans who are dying in these cities.
Yeah.
As if that's somehow different.
These are not Africans.
These are not Africans. Therefore, this is more important. But I think the importance of the Ukraine war in relation to both Africa and Europe is much bigger than we imagine. So, first of all, this war is taking place at the point at which the world was finally starting to address climate change. And the world is going to gather in Egypt soon to discuss.
Yeah.
It's crunch time, really. We have to move, we have to start acting in concert. Massive amounts of investment, massive amounts of development. The GERD is a perfect example of I think the largest development project in the world, most transformative one you could possibly imagine, which is clean energy. In this context, you have this war which is destroying the economies of all the global south. Like, there may not be any sanctions being directly imposed by the US on Ethiopia, but the effect of this war in terms of the inflation, the food crisis, the oil price, is as if there were sanctions being imposed on every poor country, every developing country on the planet.
Yeah.
Now, there is a flip side to that, and that is that the United States is alienating its European allies increasingly. So, I mean, I mentioned Germany and France previously, probably having a much softer, more interested, well, more sympathetic perspective towards Africa to Ethiopia than the Americans. And part of the reason that they have that more sympathetic perspective is because they see it as a threat.
Yeah.
They're very, very worried about migration. And in terms of, okay, right at the moment they're facing sort of the risk of World War III breaking out because of crazy failures in diplomacy, which I think they are increasingly, and their voters are increasingly attributing towards the conduct of the United States.
Mm.
So this in some respect creates an opportunity for Ethiopia to end the US belligerence. I mean, who wants two wars? Why would the Europeans want to be fighting two wars at once? The media have given up on trying to cover both wars. I was talking to Samuel Getachew, who's a journalist here. He has been discontinued from Al Jazeera as their correspondent, along with stringers from all over the world, because Al Jazeera wants to invest all of its money in the Ukraine war. And I mean, seriously, I don't know what other people think of the Ukraine war coverage, but it just makes its glorification of war and its glorification of violence is horrific. Now, it has other massive effects here. There are new arms that are being developed and are being deployed. Arms which were deployed in earlier parts of the Ethiopian war are now being deployed in Ukraine, the Bayraktar drones in particular. And I'm very concerned that other weapons which are currently being used in Ukraine are now going to come here, and they're going to appear here, because that's how military technology and techniques evolve. So I don't know. I mean, I think when it comes to COP27, it's time for there to be a sort of like a show up and deliver, or stop destroying our environment, stop destroying our economies, a breakaway. I mean, the rich West represents I think maybe 10, 12% of the population of this planet. The other 88% are everybody else.
Yeah.
And they are all being exploited, and they're all vulnerable to and being destroyed by the financial consequences, in particular in relation to energy and food, of this war. I mean, this is the most irresponsible US government when it comes to foreign policy, I think. Definitely since George Bush Jr., but maybe for longer. Mm-hmm. I don't know that I've ever seen a foreign policy team that seemed to be less capable of actually delivering any significant results. I mean, the Iran nuclear deal seems to now be going up in flames. I mean, the world is on fire.
Yeah, Alastair, thank you so much for your ideas and for coming here and sharing with us your thoughts, your observations.
It's a pleasure.
Well, dear viewers, with that, we come to the end of today's program, and many thanks for being with us. Till I see you next time with another program. It's goodbye from me, Shifaranago. Bye-bye.